Hello, welcome to my channel. Today's video is the first in a series about the inclusion of migrants in Swedish and German educational systems in the wake of the migrant crisis. So why these two countries in particular? Well, Germany accepted the largest total number of migrants during the roughly 2 years of the migrant crisis, with 1.2 million new applications for asylum registered, and Sweden had the highest rate of acceptance per capita in the EU, nearly double the rate of Germany. So arguably these two countries were impacted the most by the influx of migrants during the crisis. Each of the videos deals with a different part of the educational system: preschool, elementary school, secondary school, and basic adult education. This video will focus on preschool for migrants in Germany and Sweden. Now, I'm going to use the term migrants today for a couple of reasons. In Europe, migrant is the preferred term for what we in the US generally call immigrants. Also, although many of the migrants who came to Europe in the past several years were refugees or asylum seekers, these are legal terms and don't necessarily apply to all of the migrant populations in the European educational systems. If you want to brush up on your terminology, I'll link my migrant, refugee, immigrant definition video below. Immigration to Germany and Sweden, or really any Western European nation, is nothing new. After World War II, waves of Southern and Eastern Europeans went north and west in search of economic opportunity. There was plenty of work in areas destroyed by the war, and these migrants helped fill in the population that had been lost. Although the majority of migrants were initially working-aged men, and they were initially assumed to be temporary transplants, hence the German word for this group, Gastarbeiter, or guest worker, they often permanently settled and had families in the host country because their labor was economically more valuable in Western Europe than it was in their home country. Because of this, both Sweden and Germany have significant experience with migrants in their school systems. But even those veteran systems were thrown for a loop by the sheer numbers of migrants that they were asked to accommodate, and especially by the unaccompanied minors who needed far more than a simple school enrollment to successfully integrate into their new surroundings. There is some disagreement between sources about the structure of German childcare and preschools. The terminologies appear to have regional preferences and be somewhat interchangeable, so bear that in mind if you read other sources. In most localities in Germany, preschool has two levels. The Kita, short for Kindertagesstätte, which I think roughly translate to child day places, is for children ages 0 to 2. The government guarantees, in theory at least, a spot for every child at a Kita when they turn 1 year old. I say in theory because in some areas, particularly Berlin and its suburbs, there is a serious shortage of spots. Some parents are having to commute several hours daily to get to their reserved spot because all of the Kitas near them are at capacity. Other parents have been forced to stay at home with their children instead of working. Although I cannot prove a direct causal link between the increased migration to Germany and the lack of Kita spaces, they do coincide time-wise. If you are in Berlin or another area of Germany having this problem and have updates about the Kita crisis, please comment below. The second level of preschool is kindergarten for 3 to 5-year-olds. This is another situation where the places are statutorily guaranteed, but in reality is not always available. They require a government voucher which must be obtained in the locality where you reside. There are a mix of public and private options for providers at both levels, and costs vary significantly by state. On the low end, in direct response to the increase of migrant and asylum-seeking children in their kitas and kindergartens, and as an acknowledgement that preschool is one of the most important things we can do as educators to get non-native speakers prepared for school, the city-state of Berlin eliminated tuition in public facilities. Parents now only pay the cost of food provided to the children during the day. By contrast, the northernmost state, Schleswig-Holstein, uses a sliding scale of up to 9% of household income to determine the cost of tuition. The other 14 states fall somewhere in between these two extremes. Now, despite the variance in costs, the vast majority of children are in some sort of preschool program, about 85% of 0 to 5-year-olds, closer to 97% if we isolate the kindergarten-aged children. Now, there is no centralized curriculum in Germany. Education is a state-by-state issue, just like it is in the US. There are some federal guidelines when speaking about compulsory schooling, but not so much for preschool. There are, however, 4,000 public kindergartens which have federally funded intensive language programs for students of migrant backgrounds. Now, that is an official term. It is their equivalent of what the US calls an English learner. Interestingly, though, a recent study found that regular preschool activities in mixed classes increase language acquisition more than the segregated instructional protocol in the federally funded programs, and honestly that makes sense. At the preschool and early elementary level, schooling is mainly about building language. So my guess, although the study did not make this jump, is that the interaction with German-speaking peers exposes kids to a wider variety of language than the intensive curriculum, and that the peer interactions provide the German learners with the motivation to learn the language. This would be an interesting study if you could figure out how to get preschoolers to actually give you that information. So let's move north to Sweden, a much smaller, more centralized education system. Sweden promotes universal preschool with a focus on language development, time outdoors, and democratic ideals such as the equality of all people, self-determination and independence, and tolerance. There is a bare-bones curriculum which outlines the basics of what students should learn during preschool, but we're talking a couple of pages which covers 5 years of schooling, so it's very minimal in guidance. Beyond this document, there's a good deal of freedom for the localities to design the school day and the facilities as they choose. Many localities situate their preschools within the compulsory schools, sharing playgrounds and other facilities, and there are a range of attendance structures from part-time a couple days a week to full-time 5 days. Now, families choose what works for them, and nearly every family chooses some sort of attendance because 80% of 1 to 5-year-olds were enrolled in 2018. There are programs in preschool and compulsory schools for migrants in Sweden, but they are not to learn the Swedish language. Rather, they focus on developing literacy in the mother tongue or home language. This is a system that has some failures in implementation. There's a large discrepancy between the number of students preschool through 9th grade who qualify for mother tongue instruction and the number actually enrolled. This is likely because if there are fewer than 15 students in a school who speak a particular language, or if there's no qualified instructors, the schools are exempt from that provision. Since there's not a single university-based program to qualify potential instructors in all of Sweden, there is likely to be a serious lack of qualified personnel. The final thing I want to talk about in terms of Swedish preschool is the attitude of some instructors. A study published recently explored teacher attitudes towards their migrant students and found that often the teachers viewed students as traumatized and fragile and as needing the security of the teacher-student relationship. While this certainly comes from a place of wanting to help the children, this narrative of fragility has some downsides. The teachers who viewed their migrant students as damaged goods, essentially, were more likely to have lower expectations of the students' and families' ability to transition to Swedish life. This affected their dealings with the parents in some cases, as the teacher saw the parents as unable to provide stability for the children and unlikely to live up to the standards of Swedish parenting. The researchers describe this as a cautionary tale because the combined effects basically rob the students and families of agency. So what do you think? Does a narrative of fragility when dealing with migrant students help teachers empathize, or does it color the teachers' interactions with students and families in a negative way? As always, like, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications about migrants and refugees in the educational system and the news, and stay tuned for a second video in this series about primary schooling in Germany and Sweden. Ciao!